Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about the various ring-induced delusions of grandeur that various characters undergo throughout the course of the Lord of the Rings. A couple of these arguably aren't really ring-induced, but they do still kind of point to the same thing I'm trying to get at, which is the nature of how the ring affects the will and mind of people other than its maker, Sauron. So I'll get to those last because they're kind of a separate category, but there are at least three that we can definitely put in the category of the ring is influencing the mind of the person who currently possesses or wants to possess it, and we can see a little bit about how the ring operates through that. So let's get started. Now we do get hints about the ring and its nature earlier in the novel. Gandalf tells Frodo in Bag End that the ring will eventually come to possess the owner rather than the owner possessing the ring. And we also find out that Frodo, even in the comfort and safety of his own home, after knowing what the ring is, can't bring himself to toss the thing into a very small house fire that couldn't really possibly even damage it. So we know already that the ring very much is about possessing the mind of its owner, but we don't really get a clear example of how it affects the mind until we get to Boromir's attempt to take the ring near the end of the first novel, The Fellowship of the Ring. When that happens, Boromir is trying to convince Frodo to give him the ring so that he can use it as a weapon in the war against Sauron rather than destroying it. He doesn't possess it at this point, obviously, but he's trying to gain possession of it, and it's right there in front of him. He knows Frodo is carrying it. So just a few of the salient features of the exchange between the two of them, I think, are in order. I'll read a little bit of that. And it is a bit different than in the novel. I mean, the movie, rather. The movie kind of cuts it a bit short, but there's some interesting stuff in the novel that gives a little extra detail. So let me just read a few bits from that exchange. Boromir, of course, starts off with the idea that he wants to use it as a weapon. And Frodo says, "Were you not at the council?" answered Frodo, "because we cannot use it, and what is done with it turns to evil." Boromir is frustrated with this idea, and to kind of sum up, he basically suggests maybe some of these elves, half-elves, and wizards, maybe they, would fall prey to the ring. But he said, "True-hearted men, we will not be corrupted. We of Minas Tirith have been staunch through long years of trial. We do not desire the power of wizard lords, only strength to defend ourselves, strength in a just cause. And behold, in our need chance brings to light the ring of power. It is a gift, I say, a gift to the foes of Mordor. It is mad not to use it, to use the power of the enemy against him. The fearless, the ruthless, these alone will achieve victory. What could not a warrior do in this hour? A great leader? What could not Aragorn do? Or if he refuses, why not Boromir? The ring would give me power of command." And notice here, if you're actually reading along, command has a capital C, which is interesting. I'll come back to that in a minute. "How I would drive the hosts of Mordor, and all men would flock to my banner." And then Boromir, it kind of sums up the rest of his monologue. He doesn't quote him, but he talks about walls and weapons, the mustering of men. He drew plans for great alliances and glorious victories to be, and he cast down Mordor and became himself a mighty king, benevolent and wise. Suddenly he stopped and waved his arms. And then he goes back to, "And yet they want us to throw it away," and he gets all mad. He tries to convince Frodo, "Let me at least try it. Come with me to Minas Tirith for a little while and make a trial of my plan. Lend me the ring." He comes up with all these kind of rationalizations trying to get Frodo to give in, to give him the ring and all this. So I just kind of want to leave the main thing there. But one of the things that we can kind of see in his monologue is, like in most of the other monologues, and this will come out a little more, one of the things that the ring does is it makes the goals you want to achieve seem much easier than they actually are. He's talking about great alliances and all this stuff. We've already gotten hints that there are no more great alliances going to occur. Gondor is more or less on its own. That's not to say that nobody's on Gondor's side, but to the extent that the other peoples of Middle-earth fight Mordor, it's also kind of individually, because most of them are isolated. They don't have the force of arms, frankly, to all join together and push against Mordor. That happened at the beginning of the Third Age, the end of the Second Age. It won't happen again. Mordor is much too strong, and the Free Peoples are much too weak. So we can see that the ring is kind of playing on Boromir's mind, and of course it's playing on the particular aspect of Boromir's mind, which is he is first and foremost a warrior. That's what Boromir is. He's not really anything else. He's not interested in lore, diplomacy, anything other than achievement of his victory by the force of arms. And it's interesting, too, that it points out that he would become king after all this. Now, this is interesting partially because of what comes along later when Frodo meets Faramir. Faramir tells him about a conversation Boromir had with Denethor when they were much younger, where Boromir asked, how long does it take before the steward can become a king? Basically pointing out, we haven't had a king in many, many generations. Why haven't we given up, searching for a king again? And Faramir is basically pointing to, this is kind of Boromir's idea. He wants to be, in that highest position. That's kind of what Boromir wants. Another interesting thing here is how Boromir uses different rationalizations, which is another key feature that we'll see pop up again and again with Ring-Induced Delusions of Grandeur. He says, what could Aragorn not do? He's trying to make it look like it's not all about him. But interestingly enough, if you pay attention to his words, you can see it really is all about him. The fact that he wants to be king after making this great victory and all that. But while he's giving away the inner parts of his mind, he's also trying to hide it by saying things. What about Aragorn? What about... And so you could see here that the ring is both playing on his natural desires, playing them up, but also trying to downplay it as much as possible in a way to convince Frodo. So again, these features will pop up again and again, but another interesting point, and this is the last thing I want to say about Boromir, is where he says that the fearless, the ruthless, these alone will achieve victory. If he had just said fearless, that would have been not too worrisome, but when he says the ruthless, now that's a little, there again, you're getting that little inner glimpse of what Boromir really has in mind that's not quite healthy, because a ruthless person achieving victory, it's not quite clear that a ruthless person achieving victory is really what you want in the first place. So again, he's kind of giving away a little bit too much with that line. At any rate, after this monologue, of course, he tries to convince Frodo. Frodo, says no. He gets angry. He kind of backs down, realizing he's gone too far. He goes through the pattern until he finally tries to take the ring from Frodo. But that's our first real experience with a ring-based delusion of grandeur, and that kind of sets the tone for the rest that we're going to see. Now let's move on to the next one. I almost forgot to come back to that one little remark about command with a capital C. It's not entirely clear what Tolkien means here by capitalizing that word, but I find it interesting that earlier in the novel, when they're in Moria and Gandalf is fighting off, we don't exactly know what, because in the movie we get this fight scene with orcs and then a troll comes in and they defeat the troll and then they're off again. In the book, it's a little bit different because they do fight off the orcs, but then they all kind of leave except Gandalf, because Gandalf is using magic to hold the door against something big and powerful. We don't know exactly what it is. Gandalf later surmises that it might be a troll, but given that we then also later find out there's a Balrog, it might have been the Balrog. We don't know. But he basically says it was so powerful that he had to use a word of command. And that, of course, is also capitalized. Word of command there, obviously you get the idea it's something he can do as a wizard, but I don't think it's like magic in the usual sense. I think it's like he's literally drawing on the power of the divine in some sense to literally just will something to be so, as opposed to, I've done a video on magic in Tolkien, and my surmise that magic is largely based on the given user's knowledge of the music of the Ainur. I'll link to that video here so you can go get a little more explanation of what I mean. But here I think Gandalf is talking about something different. I think he's talking about just raw power. And so I wonder here if Boromir is also talking about something similar. He will just have the raw power to do things. And what's interesting about that is he would have power of command. Command meaning in his framework, of course, military command. He would be able to command other people. He may not necessarily be thinking of it in terms of dominating other people's wills, such that he just overrides their free will, but you have to think that that's probably where that's going. At the very least, he's considering it as he would be a much better commander because of his ability to maybe not unduly, but at least supernaturally influence the minds of others. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's interesting that that word gets capitalized. As far as I know, Gandalf's use is the only other instance of that. And so to the extent that we have any hints at all, I think that's the only one we have as to what Boromir means. But that's just me, kind of speculating there. If you have other ideas, I'd love to hear them. Now let's move on to our second delusion. Fairly early in the Two Towers, well, depending on how you count it, fairly early in the Frodo and Sam half of the Two Towers, I should say, we get what is probably the most amusing version of a Ring-Induced Delusion of Grandeur, and that's in the character of Gollum. Because Gollum, at one point, when he's having his internal debate about, do I keep my promise? Do I, try to get around my promise? Do I kill both of these hobbits in their sleep and take the ring? Do I be nice because Frodo is nice to me? He then kind of goes off on a slight tangent about what would happen if he got the ring back. And it's not a very extended moment, so I'm not going to read it directly, but I want to point out some of the key features just to kind of give us a highlight. So when he's talking about what would happen when he gets the ring back, of course, some of the stuff he imagines is fairly, not mundane per se, but what you would expect. He's like, we'll make Sam crawl. We'll basically get revenge on Sam because Sam is mean. And the Smeagol half of him basically says, well, we wouldn't do that to Master, would we? And the Gollum voice replies, well, no, not if it doesn't please us, implying maybe it would and we'll do it anyway. But then he kind of gets into a little more of a true delusion of grandeur type thing. And he says, we could be the master of the precious. And he means that in a sense which is more important than, just owning it, because then he goes on and says, he talks about actually combating Sauron for the mastery of the ring. And he even says that, we could be Lord Smeagol, Gollum the Great, the Gollum. And this is where it gets really amusing because he's coming up with titles for himself. And some of them, when he ends with the Gollum, it's really funny just because of how, on the one hand, he's being quite serious about it, but on the other hand, it's just really odd, the Gollum. For one thing, there's no other Gollum there, in Middle-earth as far as we know. So claiming that as a title, which at first was a name that was given to him as a, deprecatory, not a nice name to give him, and he's going to claim it basically as his the Gollum title. That's just funny. But the other thing that he brings up is, we can have fish 3 times a day, fish from the sea. And here you get, kind of a little more of the way that the ring is working on his own mind. Gollum's mind, partially through his deprivations over hundreds of years living in the Misty Mountains, has gotten very small. He is a narrow, myopically minded person at this point. His favorite food is fish, and that's really kind of all he thinks about other than getting the ring back, is feeding his hunger, because he's a hungry guy, especially at this point in the story. He's suffered a lot of hunger. So what does his mind naturally go to? What's the thing that I like to eat the most? Fish. There's the sea, there's fish out in the sea that he's never had before, and I have to give a little credit here. I never really would have thought of this on my own, but I've been listening to Dr. Corey Olson's material on iTunes University. He's also known as the Tolkien professor, and he kind of mentioned the fact that he would have considered the sea fish, an exotic thing. I wouldn't have thought of that on my own, so I do have to give credit there. And I recommend you listen to his stuff generally, by the way. It's really good material on all kinds of stuff about Tolkien's works. But you get the idea here that even though Gollum is having delusions of grandeur, they're very, very tailored to his own little tiny mind, because the two things that he comes up with are, I'll be in charge, and I'll get fish 3 times a day, and I'll get it from wherever I want. Now again, we can see the ring really playing on him, because it's like, how is Gollum going to become a king or anything in that sense, such that he could order other people to bring him fish? It's interesting because, of course, Gollum, before leaving the Misty Mountains, didn't really know anything about the true nature of the ring. He just knew that it made him invisible. He didn't know any of its power beyond that. And so it's only after he gets tormented by Sauron and learns a little bit more about the ring that he learns it grants a certain measure of power as well. And so you get this idea that he's still not really clued in 100%, but even if he was clued in 100%, it's really playing up like you have enough power to really become something big in Middle Earth. And of course, we all know something as small and powerless as Gollum couldn't really do that, no matter how long he owned the ring. He simply doesn't have enough innate power of his own. But again, that's the ring making him think he can do a lot more, and it'll be a lot easier than it actually would be. So that's kind of Gollum's little delusion of grandeur. Now let's move on to the next one. Now in The Return of the King, we get our third instance of a clear delusion of grandeur, but this one is a little bit different. Unlike with Boromir and Gollum, who are actively after the ring, trying to get it, in this particular case, it's Samwise, who is basically on the borders of Mordor. He's just kind of crossed over to the Mordor side of the mountains, and he's having these delusions of grandeur because he's getting close to the source of its power, and it's really beginning to exert its influence. It's not because he's wanting it, he already has it. And it's not necessarily because he wants to use it, he's just being tempted. But the way in which it tempts Sam is interesting, and I want to kind of get into this. Now, again, this is a little bit different from the movie. If all you're familiar with is the movie, here Sam has left Frodo after not being able to rescue him from the orcs because he didn't make it in time to get in with Frodo. He's trying to find another way in. In the process of that, he kind of gets over a ledge in the mountains. Then he sees Mount Doom, and then he thinks about the ring, but he decides not to use it because he knows if he did, it would be all over. Sauron would spot him. It would be hopeless. But I'm going to read again a section of this because I think here the language does make a difference. It's not quite like Gollum where you can just kind of pass over it and it's a little funny. Here the language is important. So whenever Sam is looking, he says he felt that he had from now on only 2 choices: to forbear the ring, though it would torment him, or to claim it and challenge the power that sat in its dark hold beyond the Valley of Shadows. Already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocking to his call as he marched to the overthrow of Barad-dûr. And then all the clouds rolled away, and the white sun shone, and at his command the Vale of Gorgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring and claim it for his own, and all this could be. And then, of course, he kind of snaps out of it. But it says in the explanation of how he resists it, he knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, and not a garden swollen to a realm. His own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. Now this is interesting on multiple levels, because Sam is in some way getting the same kind of delusions of grandeur as Boromir. But it's not quite the same, because he doesn't have any delusions about commanding people. Armies would flock to him and he would be the hero of the age. He's seeing himself as the hero, but he's not really, we don't get any hint here that he's seeing it as he's doing all of the commanding and everything else. It's just he's kind of the leader of the resistance, so to speak. And it's also interesting too, because what happens when he wins? Gorgoroth becomes a garden. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Sam is a gardener. What's he interested in? He thinks that this vast, barren wasteland should become a garden again, and he can do that if he takes the ring. Here, of course, we see the delusion of grandeur. He can't change the weather. He can't change the soil. He can't make Mordor into a garden, even if he wanted to. But there's the ring playing on his fantasies. And of course, the other interesting thing about it is he's the only one that really resists the ring. And it says that the two things that bring him out of it are his love for his master and his plain hobbit sense. And he realizes both that the ring is just trying to cheat him. He gets that. He actually has enough presence of mind to realize all these delusions are delusions. But he also recognizes that he's not powerful enough to do all the things that he's thinking about. He's not large enough to bear such a burden. He recognizes, I'm just a small player here. I have a role, and it involves the ring, but I don't have the stature to do all of this other stuff. That's not what I'm here for. So it's interesting that Sam, of all the people who have these ring-induced delusions, realizes both flaws in the delusions themselves. They are delusions. It's just a cheat. It's just the ring trying to mess with your mind. And it's a delusion in the sense that I couldn't do it even if I did take the ring. I'm not powerful enough to achieve what the ring makes me want to think I could achieve. So Sam here, of course, proves to be the best of everybody and resists the ring, and we know where the story goes from there. But it's just interesting to see how it still carries forth that pattern of it's giving you ideas that you could do more than you could do, and it's playing on your specific mindset, in this case Sam being a gardener. But Sam knows both problems with that. He knows I'm not big enough to do anything like that, even if I took the ring, and the ring is just doing this to my brain anyway. It's not real. So it's really interesting to see how the pattern continues, but Sam breaks the pattern in terms of resisting the temptation. So now, those being out of the way, those are the three main ones that are clear indications of you have a delusion of grandeur. I now also want to take a look at Galadriel and Saruman, because they have not so much delusions of grandeur, but they do have comments to make about what they think in terms of the ring that are also, I think, instructive. So let's take a look at those. So first I want to talk about Saruman. Gandalf is recounting in the Council of Elrond his conversation with Saruman when he goes to visit him before he learns Saruman was really a traitor, and Saruman imprisons him on the top of Orthanc. Saruman is trying to talk Gandalf into joining him, and he's not totally overt about it, not quite as overt as he is in the movie, but he does basically say, a new power is rising, there's no resisting it, we would do well to join with that power. Unlike in the movie where he just kind of leaves it there, Saruman follows that up with, over time we can come to direct its will, its power, its policies, and maybe even eventually overthrow it and come to rule the power ourselves. And of course, he's referring to the ring here. It's interesting because the way he words it, the power could be either Sauron or the ring in certain uses of his, different places where he uses the word. So it's a little weird how he's going about this, and I think that's a good indication that he's doing that rationalization thing again. The ring is kind of getting him, even though he's never been near the ring, the idea of the ring is causing him to rationalize. But he's going at this in a way that he's trying to convince Gandalf to join him. And he says, we may deplore, certain evils done along the way, but it's all in the service of a higher good, achieving knowledge and order and all this other stuff. And Gandalf, of course, basically tells him, this is the kind of thing that the servants of Sauron say to people to fool them. And of course he's right, but Saruman is trying to convince him to go along, and Gandalf, he knows, is not going to go along with just outright being in service to Mordor. So he has to put it in terms of, we can come to direct its policies by becoming its trusted allies and all this other stuff. And Gandalf, of course, is having none of it. Gandalf knows that Saruman is deluded here because Saruman Saruman, of course, does want the ring for himself, and so he's looking at it that way, and he really would like to eventually claim the ring for his own. But the other aspect here that Gandalf points out is only one hand at a time can wield the ring. He's basically pointing out, look, Saruman, even if your plan worked out, only one of us can actually have the ring. And if it's going to be you, I'm probably going to be in the trash bin, and the other way around as well. So it's like, let's assume we could actually overthrow Sauron after he got the ring. Highly unlikely. Even if we did, who's going to get the ring? You or me? It can't be both. So he's pointing out, your plan doesn't even make sense on its own terms. And so we get a little hint there of Saruman being deluded, although it's not ring-induced, it is about the ring. And so again, we see that rationalization, that in the very plan of directing the power or overthrowing Sauron himself, even in those terms, that's kind of a delusion in terms of he probably couldn't actually achieve that. There's also some question as to whether Saruman is even being serious, because as I mentioned, Saruman does want the ring for himself. So it's not exactly clear what his motives here are, because Gandalf later says that Saruman was a traitor, and doubly so. He betrayed the Free Peoples, but he also betrayed Sauron. Was he always a traitor to Sauron, even when he first pretended to serve him, or was he actually serving him but later became a traitor? You know, there's some hints about that in other writings other than Lord of the Rings, but I don't want to get into that here. But that's Saruman's little brush with the ring. Galadriel, of course, we get her encounter with the ring when Frodo offers it to her. And I'm going to give her a quotation because it's fairly short and it is a little more extended than in the movie. She says, "And now it comes at last. And now at last it comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night. Fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair." And then it continues, "She lifted up her hand, and from the ring that she wore there issued a great light that illumined her alone and left all else dark. She stood before Frodo, seeming now tall beyond measurement, and beautiful beyond enduring, terrible and worshipful. Then she let her hand fall, and the light faded, and suddenly she laughed again. And lo, she was shrunken, a slender elf woman clad in simple white, whose gentle voice was soft and sad." So here we see not so much a delusion of grandeur, I don't think. I don't think here Galadriel is speaking out of a delusion, because I think Galadriel probably could do all of that. Galadriel is one of the very first elves. She was born in Valinor, and she's said to be one of the greatest of the Noldor, short of Feanor only, perhaps. And so she has a lot of innate power. She also has an elven ring, so combining the elven ring with the One Ring, what could she really do? I mean, she probably could overthrow Sauron. I mean, let's recall that Sauron was overthrown and defeated by Elendil and Gil-galad, and Gil-galad was not born in Valinor. Elendil was a man. She is much older, more powerful than both, and has a ring of power of her own. And neither Gil-galad nor Elendil had the ring of power. Sauron did, and they were able to defeat him. Took two of them, and they both died in the effort. But anyway, the point is, I think Galadriel really could actually overthrow Sauron, given the ring of power was in her control. So I don't think she's having a delusion here. I think she's kind of being honest about, this is what would happen. You would set me up as a queen in place of the Dark Lord. Now, she's not saying that's Frodo's intent, but she's saying that's what would happen. And she's basically saying, because of the ring and its power over the minds of other people, you know, if I took this thing and did that, this is how it would go. I would not be just nice. She sets it up in interesting contrasts. Beautiful and terrible as the dawn and the night. You know, powerful like storms and lightning, and stronger than the foundations of the earth. You know, she's got a lot of different interesting juxtapositions in this little passage. And she's basically pointing out, there will be a sense in which I will still seem as beautiful and whatnot as I am now, but there will be a much darker side, and it will not be pretty for some people. So she's basically pointing out, this is, even if I did that and I did the good thing that we all want to happen, which is the defeat of Sauron, it would end up pretty badly. So here I think it's not a delusion, but she is kind of giving an idea of what would result. And this kind of echoes what Gandalf said to Frodo in the early part of the story in Bag End, where he basically told him, I would use the ring to do good, but through me it would gain a power too great and terrible to imagine, and I would become like the Dark Lord. And Gandalf later tells Denethor basically the same thing. I don't trust myself with the ring. So you definitely get that idea that even the best people among them can't really be trusted with it. It's interesting, therefore, that Sam is the only one who really kind of passes the test when it comes to possession of the ring. He's the only one that freely gives it up, other than Bilbo at the very beginning of the story, but that's before anybody really knows anything about it. And that took a lot of pressure from Gandalf, so it's not entirely free. Sam is the only one who just voluntarily gives it to Frodo back, and doesn't keep it for himself. He's also the only one that seems to totally resist the temptation. Frodo, of course, gives in at the crack of doom, but anyway, that's another story. Anyway, those are the instances of the ring kind of playing on different people's minds and similar instances. So let's kind of wrap up and see what we think about this generally. So as I mentioned earlier, of course, two of the key things that we can see running throughout these different examples is the fact that the ring kind of plays on the natural way that a person's mind works. Sam thinks of gardens, Gollum thinks of fish, Boromir thinks of alliances and wars. Saruman thinks in terms of crafty politics. Galadriel thinks in terms of ruling a kingdom, overthrowing the bad guy. Those all kind of fit perfectly well. The other thing that it does is it tends to make people think of things being easier than they are. Sam can't really do any of the things he has delusions about. None of them really can. Galadriel perhaps being the one exception to that, and she's the one who's really not deluded to the extent that the rest of them are. Sam, in a sense, isn't deluded other than the fact that he has the delusions, but he does resist them. So those are kind of the two key elements that flow throughout. And the other real element that's consistent is it takes somebody of already a well-formed moral character to really say no. Gandalf says no before he ever, he's offered it, but he says no because he knows better. Galadriel does the same. Sam has it. And so his temptation is, in a sense, greater than Gandalf's and Galadriel's, because Gandalf recognizes, if I had it, that's when it would become dangerous. Don't give it to me. Don't even get there. Sam has it, more or less out of necessity. And so his temptation is, he's in the position that Gandalf doesn't even want to be in. Worse still, he's in Mordor where it's more powerful in its temptation. And he still resists it. It's interesting because Samwise is, in some sense, the least of all these characters. He is the lowest, the least wise, the humblest in pretty much every sense. And that's probably exactly why he manages to succeed. He always sees himself as being in a position of service to Frodo. That's more or less his entire reason for being on the quest. He has no interest in power, grandeur, any of these things. Frodo doesn't either, really, but the difference between him and Frodo is Frodo at least has enough knowledge and wisdom to think of himself as a slightly higher, and I don't want to use that in like a prejudicial term or anything, but Frodo is in some sense higher on the scale than Samwise. If Samwise and Frodo both had tried to use the ring, Frodo probably could have gotten a little farther with it than Sam. Not much, but a little bit. So Frodo, in that sense, has more temptation because it's more realistic that he might be able to achieve something with it, even though he really couldn't. But Samwise, being who he is and being very truly the most humble character of all of them, recognizes this is not for me. And so it's really interesting just to see how it plays out among all these different people. The only other person who basically says no to the ring is Faramir, and he again never actually comes into possession of it. He's in probably the better position of the rest of them in the sense that he could very easily take it if he wanted to, and he has motives for doing so in some ways, but, and again, if you haven't read the novel, Faramir in the novel, Faramir in the movie, very different people. Faramir in the novel never actually tries to take the ring, so don't go by the movie. That's not relevant to my discussion here. So anyway, those are the different aspects of that, and I hope you enjoyed kind of looking at those and getting some idea of what's going on there. And if you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please share it around. You can also subscribe to me here on the channel if you want to learn more about Tolkien and the worlds he created, or you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.